Eric Clapton has spent more than 60 years living inside sound. Every night, his guitar spoke for him, louder than words, louder than anything else in his life. The world called him a genius, a hero, even a god. But behind the applause was a man who was never fully at peace. Clapton says he chased happiness in every way a musician could, through bigger crowds, longer tours, and the rush of fame. Yet the calm he wanted always slipped away. Only later, when the lights faded and the stages emptied, did he begin to understand what peace really felt like. This is the story of how a boy who never felt wanted became one of the greatest guitarists in history, and how, after losing almost everything, he learned that the most powerful note is the one you no longer need to play. Eric Patrick Clapton was born on March 30th, 1945 in Ripley, a small town in Surrey, England. His father was a young Canadian soldier who returned home before Eric was born. His mother, only 16, couldn't raise a baby alone, so her parents, Eric's grandparents, stepped in to raise him as their own. To protect everyone's reputation in a time when single motherhood was judged harshly, they told Eric that his grandparents were his real parents and that his mother was his older sister. He grew up believing that story. When he was 9 years old, he discovered the truth. The woman he called Mom was really his grandmother. The sister he looked up to was actually his mother. The news hit him hard. He felt confused, angry, and betrayed, as if the ground beneath his life had quietly moved. From that moment on, he carried a sense of distance from the people around him. He became quiet, shy, and careful with trust. He later said that he always felt like an outsider, even in his own family. Music became the one thing that never lied to him. His grandfather owned a small gramophone and a few old records, jazz, swing, and American blues. When Eric first heard Big Bill Broonzy and Muddy Waters, something clicked. The voices sounded wounded but strong. He didn't need to understand the words, he felt them. At 13, he begged for a guitar. His grandparents bought him a cheap Hoyer acoustic with steel strings so tight they cut his fingers. He didn't care. He practiced until the pain became part of the rhythm. The house was small, the walls thin, and his grandmother would call up the stairs, "Eric, it's late." But he kept playing, trying to copy every note he heard on the radio. In school, he stayed quiet. When other kids went to football practice, he went home to play alone in his room. He filled notebooks with chord diagrams and little reminders. Each song he learned made the world feel slightly less uncertain. By his mid-teens, he had found a new kind of family, the musicians who lived inside those records. Their sadness matched his own, and their confidence gave him something to aim for. He didn't know it yet, but that loneliness would become the power behind his music. The boy who felt unwanted had found his voice, and soon the world would be listening. By his late teens, Eric Clapton was known around London as the quiet kid who could make a guitar talk. He joined a small rhythm and blues group called the Yardbirds in 1963, where he first tasted real success. Their sound blended American blues with a British edge, and his solos cut through the smoke of crowded clubs. Audiences had never heard anything like it. He played with precision and soul, chasing every bend and slide from the records he'd loved as a boy, but pushing them harder, faster, louder. Yet even at 20, Clapton was already chasing purity over popularity. When the Yardbirds began leaning toward pop hits, he walked away without hesitation. "I just wanted to play the blues," he later said. That choice, putting honesty above fame, became the pattern of his career. Soon he joined John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, the band that made him a legend. Night after night in London clubs, his Les Paul roared through Marshall amps so powerfully that fans spray-painted the words "Clapton is God" on brick walls. It embarrassed him, but it also trapped him. Every solo had to live up to a myth that no human could sustain. By 1966, he wanted to start fresh again. He teamed up with drummer Ginger Baker and bassist Jack Bruce to form Cream, a power trio that rewrote what rock music could sound like. They mixed long, improvised jams with thunderous riffs, creating songs such as "Sunshine of Your Love" and "White Room." On stage, they were a storm, 3 musicians competing, listening, and exploding all at once. To the public, Cream were untouchable. To the band, it was chaos. Egos clashed, tempers flared, and the constant touring wore them down. Clapton later said that even while the crowd screamed his name, he often felt unseen, even in the spotlight. After a show, he would walk back to his hotel room in silence, hearing only the ringing in his ears. When Cream broke up in 1968, he tried again with Blind Faith, a so-called supergroup. It lasted one album. Success came easily. Happiness did not. He kept moving from band to band, chasing a sound that might finally feel real again. He had everything he'd ever dreamed of: fame, skill, respect, but none of it quieted the restlessness that had lived inside him since childhood. The guitar had given him a voice. Now it was starting to drown him. The more famous Eric Clapton became, the emptier he felt when the music stopped. By the end of the 1960s, he had already passed through 4 bands that shaped British rock: the Yardbirds, the Bluesbreakers, Cream, and Blind Faith. Each one carried his sound to new heights, but none of them brought him peace. His name was whispered wherever guitars were sold, yet once the lights went down, he was left alone with the same old silence. At first, he tried to drown it with work. He joined friends for jam sessions, produced albums for other musicians, and played on stage whenever anyone asked. The music was brilliant, but it couldn't touch the ache that had followed him since childhood. Soon, the escape changed form. Heroin entered his life quietly, almost politely, and then refused to leave. By 1970, he was disappearing from the public eye. The man once called God was spending days locked in dark rooms, chasing the next fix. Friends knocked on his door and heard nothing. Letters went unanswered. Concert offers piled up and went ignored. His health collapsed. His weight dropped. His fingers, once faster than thought, shook when he tried to play. A few people refused to give up on him. Pete Townsend of The Who staged a comeback concert at London's Rainbow Theatre in 1973. Clapton walked on stage pale and trembling, but when he hit the first chord, the audience erupted. For a few songs, he sounded like himself again. Afterward, he broke down backstage and admitted he didn't know if he could keep going. He tried to stay clean, but the cravings only shifted. When he finally escaped heroin, alcohol filled the space it left behind. He drank constantly, often from morning until sleep. On stage, he slurred words. Off stage, he pushed away the people who cared. Fame had given him everything except control. During those years, he fell deeply in love with Pattie Boyd, the wife of his friend George Harrison. The relationship tore at everyone involved. His obsession with her became the raw material for Layla, one of the most famous love songs in rock history, written not as a triumph, but as a confession. It was about unrequited love, he later said, about longing for something I couldn't have. By the late 1970s, he had married Pattie, but the happiness he imagined never arrived. His drinking grew worse, and their relationship unraveled under its weight. He performed when he could, canceled when he couldn't, and lived most days in a blur of touring, guilt, and self-loathing. The marriage lasted less than a decade. Pattie eventually left, worn down by the drinking and distance. Their split was painful but mutual. Years later, Clapton admitted that she had been the mirror he needed, not the cure he wanted. They reconciled as friends, and he often said that Wonderful Tonight, written for her, remained one of the few songs that still made him smile. Clapton would later describe those years as a crash in slow motion. The music still paid the bills, but it no longer saved him. He once said that every song he played back then sounded like an apology he didn't know how to finish. The man who had once played the blues to feel alive was now playing just to keep from disappearing. And before he could climb out of that darkness, life would hand him a loss that no recovery program could ever prepare him for. On March 20th, 1991, Eric Clapton's world stopped. That morning, his 4-year-old son, Connor, fell from the 53rd floor of a New York apartment building. It was a clear spring day, the kind parents remember for parks and laughter. And for Eric, it became the daytime split in two. He was in a nearby hotel when the call came. He raced to the scene, but it was already over. Reporters filled the street within hours, writing headlines about a man too numb to speak. Clapton later said that for months he could barely pick up a guitar. Even sound itself felt like a wound. "I couldn't bear to hear music," he recalled. "It reminded me of everything I'd lost." The years of addiction and fame had hardened him to pain, but nothing prepared him for this. He stopped drinking completely, retreating into silence. Friends feared he would vanish again, but instead of drugs or alcohol, he turned inward, to solitude, prayer, and slow, deliberate days. He spent hours walking alone through the city, watching other fathers lift their children onto their shoulders. It was grief without language. Out of that silence, a song began to form. At first he resisted it. Writing felt selfish. But melody had always been how he made sense of what words couldn't hold. He sat with his acoustic guitar and let the loss speak through his fingers. That song became Tears in Heaven. When it was released in 1992, listeners called it beautiful. To Clapton, it was unbearable, a letter to a child he would never see again. Each line carried both prayer and apology. Would you know my name if I saw you in heaven? He could barely perform it live, and when it won 3 Grammys, he couldn't bring himself to celebrate. It only reminded him of what suffering can cost. He once said that writing Tears in Heaven didn't heal him. It simply gave him a place to put the pain. And in that small act, he discovered a truth he'd been running from for decades. Music wasn't meant to erase sorrow. It was meant to carry it. After Connor's death, Clapton's relationship with fame changed forever. He no longer chased headlines or chart positions. He spoke more softly, spent more time at home, and began rebuilding his faith in something larger than himself. He devoted energy to causes that help children and families, quietly funding addiction recovery programs and safety initiatives. What had once been a career became a calling, not to be heard, but to understand. Out of devastation came the quiet beginnings of belief. For years, Eric Clapton tried to fix his pain with noise. Louder guitars, crowded rooms, another drink to fill the silence. After Connor's death, the old escapes lost their power. He realized that if he didn't change, grief would finish what addiction had started. He went back to rehab, this time not because others begged him to, but because he finally wanted to live. It was the beginning of a different kind of discipline. He traded chaos for structure, touring for meetings, denial for honesty. In those rooms full of strangers, he listened instead of performed. I learned how to pray, he later said. Not for things, just for peace. Through the 12-step program, he found something that fame had never offered: accountability. He stopped blaming the past, the fame, or the heartbreak. Every day he woke early, made coffee, and wrote in his journal. Sometimes about his son, sometimes about music, often about forgiveness. Slowly, the edge of his grief softened. Faith entered his life quietly. He began reading scripture, attending services, and meditating before shows. Religion wasn't new to him, but belief was. For the first time, he felt that something beyond himself had kept him alive through all the close calls. He once said, "I should have died a dozen times. Maybe I didn't, because I was meant to help someone else make it through." That idea became his mission. In 1998, he opened Crossroads, a rehabilitation center in Antigua, offering addicts a place to recover without shame. Clapton didn't just fund it, he visited often, playing music with patients and listening to their stories. He called it his second family. The center grew into a symbol of hope, proof that redemption isn't a performance, it's a daily act of service. With sobriety came clarity. His playing changed too. The fiery speed of youth gave way to restraint, fewer notes, more feeling. On albums like Pilgrim and Reptile, you can hear the difference. A man no longer trying to impress anyone, only to express what he'd survived. His voice grew rougher, but his spirit steadier. He marked each year of sobriety not with parties, but with gratitude. Birthdays and anniversaries became chances to thank the people who stayed. Friends who hadn't walked away, fans who'd forgiven his disappearances. He started speaking openly about recovery at concerts, reminding audiences that strength sometimes looks like surrender. Looking back, Clapton said that his real comeback wasn't musical, it was spiritual. "Fame didn't save me, God did," he once told an interviewer. "And if I forget that, I'll lose everything again." For the first time, life wasn't something to endure or escape. It was something to honor. And from that faith, a quieter kind of joy began to grow, the kind that would carry him into the final decades of his career with grace. By the 2000s, Eric Clapton had lived enough lives for several men, The prodigy, the addict, the father, the believer. Now, he was facing a new battle, one that couldn't be fought with willpower or faith alone. Time. The years of touring, alcohol, and volume had left their mark. His hearing began to fade. His hands sometimes went numb, the early signs of neuropathy. On stage, he'd glance at his fingers, willing them to obey. "I can still play," he said once, "but it hurts." For a man whose identity had always lived in sound, the thought of losing it was quietly terrifying. Yet instead of hiding, he adapted. He stopped chasing speed and focused on tone, that unmistakable cry of his Stratocaster that could make a single note feel like a confession. When fans asked why he didn't solo like he used to, he smiled and said, "Because now I'm listening." He spent more time at home in Surrey, recording in small studios and walking his garden at sunrise. Music became less about proving greatness and more about giving thanks for still being here to play. The concerts he did perform felt like reunions, faces he'd seen for 50 years singing back the words to Wonderful Tonight and Tears in Heaven. The applause no longer felt like worship, it felt like grace. Old friends began to fade too. In 2001, he said goodbye to George Harrison, the quiet Beatle who had once forgiven him for stealing his wife and had later become one of his closest companions again. Clapton helped organize the concert for George, calling it the hardest performance of his life. It wasn't just a tribute, it was closure. One friend honoring another in the only language they truly shared. That concert became a turning point. Clapton realized that legacy isn't about records sold or awards stacked on a shelf. It's about connection, the threads that keep you tied to the people who shaped you. He started mentoring younger guitarists, offering advice without ego. Don't play for the crowd, play for the song. As the years rolled on, the press still tried to define him. The legend, the survivor, the complicated icon. But he no longer fought the labels. "I'm just grateful I got to grow old," he said in one interview. Not everyone gets that chance. Each tour grew shorter, each encore slower. When the lights dimmed, he lingered a little longer on stage, listening to the echo fade. That sound, once his prison, had become his prayer. To him, the applause wasn't a wall of noise anymore. It was a conversation between generations. Fans, friends, and ghosts all answering the same unspoken question. Did it mean something? And in their cheers, he finally heard the answer he'd been chasing since childhood. Yes. Every note now carried the weight of a lifetime, and with every passing year, the silence that followed it began to sound sweeter. Today, Eric Clapton speaks about the end not with fear, but with understanding. After more than 60 years on stage, he knows what time takes and what it gives back. His body is slowed, his voice is rougher, and long tours are no longer possible. But the calm that once escaped him now sits quietly in every note. In recent interviews, he's spoken candidly about his health. Neuropathy has made it harder to play, and tinnitus leaves a ringing in his ears that never fades. "I can't do what I used to," he says softly, "but I can still feel it, and that's enough." He performs fewer shows now, carefully chosen, often for charity. Each one feels like a farewell and a thank you rolled into one. He spends most of his days in the English countryside, surrounded by his wife Melia and their daughters. His mornings start simply: coffee, prayer, and sometimes a few quiet bars on the guitar. The rush of fame has been replaced by rhythm, the sound of birds, the hum of wind through the garden, the laughter of his children. For a man who once lived from concert to concert, the stillness might have felt unbearable once. Now it's the reward. "Peace," he said recently, "is what I was looking for all along." He still records occasionally, not to chase charts but to share gratitude. His later albums, filled with blues standards and softer arrangements, feel less like reinventions and more like letters to his younger self. Each song says the same thing in a different way. You made it through. At charity events and small gatherings, he sometimes plays Tears in Heaven. The crowd always goes silent. He doesn't explain it anymore. He doesn't need to. The pain that once defined him has softened into acceptance. He once said, "You don't move on from loss. You move forward with it." Now, when the lights dim and he steps off stage, there's no longer that old ache to be seen or heard. Just quiet, earned, honest, and whole. Eric Clapton no longer plays to escape himself. He plays to remember the people he lost, the mistakes he survived, and the love that brought him home. Sometimes he watches old concert footage and can hardly recognize the man on screen, the restless genius who thought the next song, the next city, would finally bring peace. Now he understands what that younger version of himself was searching for all along. Not applause, but quiet. And in that quiet truth lies the reason he's finally ready to let it end.